My dear students of class 8 Durgapur Ispat Vidyalaya, I am Santipriyo sir going to discuss about your science book chapter 12 friction. We know something about friction, right? Friction. What do you mean by friction? Friction. Friction. At first we define it. What do you mean by friction? Right? We define it. Whenever a body in contact with a second body, right? Whenever a body in contact with a second body moves or tends to move, right? Whenever a body in contact with a second body moves or tends to move, that is, creates or tends to create relative motion between them, that is relative to each other, relative of one body with respect to the other and the second body with respect to the first, right? Creates or tends to create relative motion. Then a forces, actually two forces, always in pair. Forces are always in pair. We know that relative motion of one body, that is with respect to another, that is another body is supposed to be at rest. Then you consider the relative motion. Otherwise, we may consider the relative motion of the second body with respect to the first. Then obviously these are opposite, and these are opposite in direction, and must be the forces also equal and opposite, right? Then forces come into play which opposes the relative motion or tends to create relative motion. Right? Whenever a body in contact with a second body moves or tends to move, that is, creates or tends to create relative motion, then a forces come into play which opposes the relative motion or tends to create relative motion. These forces are equal and opposite, and acts and act and they act and they act and they act and they act tangential. They act tangential to the surfaces in contact, along which the relative motion creates or tends to create. Write it. Equal and opposite, and they act. Right? We erase it. Whenever a body in contact with a second body moves or tends to move, that is, creates or tends to create relative motion, then a forces come into play. Relative motion between them, obviously. Then a forces come into play which opposes the relative motion or tends to create relative motion. These forces are equal and opposite, and they act tangential. They act tangentially on the surfaces, on the two surfaces in contact with each other, right? Tangentially on the two surfaces in contact with each other, that is parallel to the creation of relative motion or tends to create relative motion with each other, in contact with each other, that is parallel to the relative motion or tends to create relative motion. Right? These forces are called, these are equal and opposite, are called forces of friction or frictional forces. Right? These forces are called forces of friction or frictional forces. Remember it. Now we supply another definition of friction. Right? Here we have a definition. Here two forces are considered. Now we only one force, that is friction, acting between the two surfaces in contact. Only one considered here. Right? The friction that is frictional force, is defined as the friction that is frictional force, is defined as the force acting develops, right? Force develops in which force develops on the two surfaces, that is for two bodies, two surfaces in contact. Friction is defined, the friction or frictional force is defined as the force develops on the two surfaces in contact which are in relative motion or tends to create relative motion. In which direction? The friction is defined, that is frictional force. Is defined as the force develops on the two surfaces in contact with each other, right? With each other, opposite to the with each other, opposite to the relative motion or tends to create relative motion, and it acts tangential, it acts tangential on the surfaces in contact, right? It is always opposite to the direction of relative motion. Direction of relative motion or tends to create relative motion, and it acts tangentially on the surfaces in contact with each other, in which relative motion creates or tends to create. In which relative motion creates or tends to create, right? We have another definition. The friction is defined as the force develops on the two surfaces in contact with each other opposite to the direction of relative motion or tends to create relative motion between them, that is the two bodies in contact, and it acts tangentially on the surfaces in contact with each other in which relative motion creates or tends to create, right? You may write this definition also. Now, erase it. Next, we know cause of friction. Right? What is the cause of friction? Cause of friction, that is why friction is developed between the two surfaces in contact when they are in relative motion or they tends to create relative motion. The main cause of friction develops is the nature of the surfaces in contact. Nature of the surfaces in contact with each other. That is roughness, polishness, whiteness, etc. Right? That is roughness of the two surfaces in contact. Is responsible for the creation of friction or frictional force. Right? That is, if the surfaces are rough, then frictional force will be large. And if the surfaces in contact are polished or whiteness, then the frictional force decreased than the rough surfaces in contact. But remember it that this force, that is frictional force, always acting opposite to the direction of relative motion or direction of the creation of relative motion, tends to create relative motion. Right? Always opposite to the motion is not correct, to the relative motion will be the correct language. Right? This is the, we know a surface when we see in naked eye maybe looks as a polished or smooth surface, but actually the surfaces is not smooth at all. If we see by magnifying, with the help of a magnifying lens or a horizontal microscope, then we see the surfaces are not polished or smooth. There are some crests and troughs. Crests and troughs. That is some portion elevated and some depressed. Right? Like this. This is a surface. We magnifying it, and another surface. Thus, these two surfaces actually interlocked. And when the two surfaces are rough, then crests and troughs are present. Crests and troughs are present. That is hills and bumps, or in another language, maybe give it, that is these surfaces when rough, and then we call it as irregularities or imperfections. Irregularities or imperfections, we call it. When these two surfaces are in contact, close contact, then these crests and troughs are interlocked with each other, which is the main cause of frictional force. Right? This interlocking is appreciably decreased when one body moves with the other over the other body, right? Also, here some points of contacts is obtained. In this case, these point of contacts contain some atoms or molecules of the two surfaces in contact, and hence adhesive force developed. Adhesive force, the attractive force between two different particles, different material particles, like, or different materials. Particles means atoms, molecules, maybe ions, right? This adhesive force also contribute some frictional force, right? It may be noted in your exercise book. This roughness we minimized by taking some steps, like by using lubricants, oil, grease, graphite, colloidal graphite or dust graphite on the two surfaces in contact. Right. Now, in your book, we have factors affecting friction. Factors affecting friction. Factors affecting friction. Factors affecting friction. That is, on which factors friction depends. On which factors friction depends, right? Number one, the nature, that is roughness, smoothness, whiteness, etc. Nature, that is roughness, smoothness, that is polishness, whiteness, etc. of the two surfaces in contact with each other. Frictional force depend upon the nature of the two surfaces in contact with each other, right? Thus, if the roughness is increased, frictional force acting between the two surfaces in contact also increased. If the smoothness, that is polishness, increased, then the frictional force will be decreased. And also in the case of whiteness, the surfaces become somewhat slippery, and hence frictional force decreased appreciably. Right? Number two, write it. Number two, the force by which the two surfaces in contact pressed to each other pressed to each other. Right? The force by which the surfaces in contact pressed to each other, pressed to each other, right? That is, if we take a heavy metal cube on a table, then the frictional force is greater than that if we placed a rubber ball or wooden shaped cube or cuboid, same dimensions, we have in this case frictional force will be less than that earlier. That is, it depends upon the force by which these two surfaces are pressed to each other, right? If we take a steel ball and of the same size, that is same dimension, wooden ball, and placed on a table, then the steel ball, when develops, steel ball gives more friction than the wooden ball or rubber ball, right? This must be noted in your exercise book. That is the nature. Nature means roughness, smoothness, whiteness, etc. of the two surfaces in contact with each other. Number 2, the force by which the two surfaces in contact press to each other. By which the two surfaces in contact press to each other. Right? Also, we see that frictional force, especially in the case of static friction, we discuss it here. Friction are of various types. This is the friction. At first we divide it into two parts, right? One is called external friction, and another is called internal friction or fluid friction. Internal friction or fluid friction. That is the friction when exists between the different layers of a fluid in motion, that is liquid or gases in motion, or if a solid body moves within the liquid or gases, right? These forces develop. The internal friction or fluid friction is developed. Fluid means which can flow, that is liquid or gases. Now, external friction are of main three types. That is static friction, Number 2, kinetic friction or sliding friction, This is also called kinetic friction or dynamic friction. Kinetic or dynamic friction, right? And another is rolling friction, right? We define them. Now, friction are of two types, external friction and internal friction or fluid friction. External friction are divided into three parts. One is called static friction, another is called sliding friction or kinetic friction or dynamic friction, and third one is called rolling friction. Note your exercise book these divisions of friction.